Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, students, so good to see all of you. My name is Mr. Little, and this very short presentation is a primer, a, so to speak, introduction to the article known as Born with a Silver Spoon, which traces the gradual evolution of world trade through the lens of the global silver trade that began roughly in the mid to early 1600s. And so this presentation is designed to sort of be a primer before you read the article, to give you some background and some information you might need to know. So let's go ahead and get to it. Really quick, this article's full title is Born with a Silver Spoon, The Origins of World Trade in 1571. It was published in 1995 by Denis O'Flynn and Arturo Giraldes. And this article will be linked in the description. If you're one of my students, you will, however, need to use your school ID to access it. If not, hopefully your teacher has given you access, so that won't be an issue. But really quick, this is a very informative and very interesting article. However, it does have a lot of what the kids would say, big-brained words. And so my suggestion is, if any of these words don't look familiar to you, perhaps look them up or become familiar with what they mean, because they may show up once or twice or 3 or 4 times, just so that you know what's going on and you won't necessarily get confused. So my suggestion would be, if you don't know what any of these words are, if you're not sure, maybe just quickly whip out the dictionary, look them up, just so you know what's going on here, okay? Alrighty. Also, there's going to be a lot of different places talked about on this map. And so, in this article. And so this map is sort of designed to keep it all straight. A lot of the places that will be mentioned in the article are described here on the map. So my suggestion would be, if you need to come back to this map while reading the article, just to kind of get an idea of what's going on, feel free to do that. Okay, that's what this map is here for. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and get into a couple of topics just to provide a little bit of background for Born with a Silver Spoon. So the very first thing I want to kind of make sure we clarify is exactly where is all this global silver coming from, right? And so all 3 of these places are discussed in the article, but I want to make sure we kind of know that the silver trade, this massive flow of precious metals around the world during the mid 1500s, has 3 main sources. One is the mountain of Potosi in Bolivia, where arguably most of the silver came from, and this is a drawing of that mountain. The other is the region of Zacatecas in Mexico, which at the time was ruled by Spain. Bolivia was also ruled by Spain at the time, as well as the city of Oda in Tokugawa, Japan. Now, this is going to be important later on when talking about how trade is conducted in Asia, both during and prior to the arrival of the silver from the Americas. So just keep in mind that Japan was also one of the largest producers of silver in the world at the time. So just, where's the silver coming from? It's coming from these places. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is we're still kind of in the age of the voyages of exploration, or the age of colonization. And while we sort of stopped talking about European efforts to reach Asia after the voyages of Columbus, it's worth keeping in mind that even after America was discovered, and even after it was discovered how rich the Americas were in terms of gold, silver, and other precious materials, raw materials, that the goal of the goal of Europeans was still to reach Asia. That was still the goal. That was like the objective. That's what everybody wanted to do. Right. So to this end, up until the 1700s, they were still looking for maybe some way to maybe go maybe north of Canada as a way to find some direct route to Asia. Right. Now, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor working for the Spanish, did prove it was possible to circumnavigate the Americas. He went all the way down past the tip of South America, but it was expensive. It was dangerous. Ferdinand Magellan himself did not survive the trip. He died in the Philippines, fighting the indigenous people there in a little civil war. So it was possible, but most European powers began to realize they're going to need to find some other way to get to Asia. And that's going to be important, because remember, the goal is still to get to the values of what is now India and what is now China, right? Even though all the Americas have all these riches and all this silver, you're going to see that getting to the markets of Asia is still the goal for the most part, even after the discovery of the Americas. So in terms of what was going on in Asia at this time, right on the edge of this giant influx of silver, is to understand that trade and commerce within Asia itself, so between what is now like India, what is now like Indonesia, and what is now China, as well as parts of Japan, the islands of the Philippines, is that all of this trade was being done by diasporic communities. It's true that the Portuguese had made their way into the Indian Ocean by this time, but they actually weren't doing much of the trade. Almost all the business was still being done by locals. So Malaysian sailors were still moving textiles like the one pictured here from Bengal down to the city of Malacca, where these things were highly prized. This is I believe this is a textile that depicts a scene from the Ramayana Hindu epic. The point is that even though by 1650 Europeans had been in Asian trade networks for about 150 years, they still weren't actually doing much of the trading. Most of the trading was still being done by diasporic communities, and that's going to shift a little bit, in part because the fall of the Ming Dynasty has such a reverberating effect that it's going to disrupt the entire trading system within East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And so while we may not have time to go into that, just keep in mind that the fall of the Ming Dynasty, the weakening of the Ming Dynasty, is going to have huge ramifications for inter-Asian trade. So keep that in mind as you read the article about the sort of gravity, the center of gravity that the Ming Dynasty is for all the local trade networks in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and South Asia. So speaking of China, we should probably talk about paper money, right? Now, you might remember that the Song Dynasty introduced paper money, but what's even more important to understand is that this paper money was the first example of what we call fiat currency. Now, today, almost every currency around the world, in fact, I think every currency in the world, unless there's one I don't know about, is a fiat currency. That means that it's detached from a precious metal. Up until the 1970s, in theory, you could take a US dollar. In theory, you could take one of these, you could take this dollar, right? You could go to the bank and you could say, my dollar is worth this much gold, give me this much gold. You could do that up until the 1970s. Legally, though, you couldn't really do it after the 1940s, but in theory, you could still do it. After the 1970s, the US and other nations gradually went away from the gold standard into currencies that just kind of float freely, and their value is pegged to each other. Right. So the sort of immediate cause of this, because this hadn't been done before in human history, was that there was just a lot of inflation. The Song Dynasty was dealing with some pretty bad inflation. The Mongols came in, took over the Song Dynasty. They just continued to print money, didn't really change that policy. Now, the Yuan Dynasty only lasted about 80, 90 years at most. And so they didn't really have a chance to get damaged by all this inflation. And then the Ming Dynasty that succeeded the Yuan Dynasty, the first emperor Hung Wu comes in and he's like, yo, I want copper coins like the old days. And his advisors told him they don't have enough copper to make all the copper coins necessary for the empire. And so they also have to go back to using paper money. Although various merchants, because they don't really like paper, it's a little bit unreliable and they don't know if it's fake or forged or real, and they're uncertain about its value, they just end up using coins from previous dynasties and coins from previous rulers, even though the ruling Ming emperors would try to ban coins like 7 different times. Coins were just considered, they were something that people liked to use because they knew it was in them. They knew they were made of copper and they knew they had a set value. So when the influx of silver finally arrives in China after 1570, this is going to be a huge game changer, because not only is this a single source of reliable metal value, and so it brings a great deal of stability to Ming Dynasty China. And it promotes a lot of inter-Asian trade. So just a little background on the paper money front. Let's also talk about some Chinese political policies. So the Ming Dynasty is perhaps known for its great works of art, but it's also known for being what some historians like to term isolationist, as in they didn't want to interact with the outside world. Now, that's not entirely true. The Ming Dynasty did receive tribute missions from lots of places around Asia, but they did have something called the Haijin system, which basically forbid foreign merchants from residing or spending long periods of time or come at all to ports on the coasts of China, specifically what's now Guangzhou and Fujian provinces, what is now like in southern China. And while the Ming Dynasty was almost never able to effectively enforce this, by the 1550s and 1560s, the navy of the Ming Dynasty had long since declined past the period of Zheng He's great voyages. What it meant, though, was that officially there couldn't be any Europeans, merchants establishing a long-term presence in China. So this is going to have a consequence in terms of how the silver trade is conducted and why the city of Manila is so important. But we'll talk about that in a second. The Chinese advisors and administrators who try to enforce this system, try to enforce a ban on all trade, just found themselves up against pirates and smugglers. And because they didn't really have the resources to defeat them, they usually just had to hire other pirates and smugglers to attack them. And so near the end of the Ming Dynasty, the government sort of relented and began to allow ships to travel, but still only some. So, this is going to have consequences down the road, as we'll see. There's also something called the single whip law, which was imposed after the silver began to flow in the 1570s and 80s. And essentially what it did was it lowered all the taxes and combined them into a single tax that everybody paid. And all of those taxes were paid in silver. Now, this was beneficial to a lot of the society in China for several reasons. One is that lower taxes, that's good. The Ming Dynasty is believed to have some of the lowest taxes in all of imperial dynastic history, as well as the fact that it streamlined the tax collection process, right? Whereas before, certain villages might have paid their taxes in rice, or they might have done manual labor for the imperial government. Now everyone just paid in silver. And this was only really a problem if you happen to live in a place where there wasn't a lot of silver. So parts of northern China were having trouble paying taxes. And this is going to have consequences down the road, both for China as well as for Spain. And when you read the article, that'll become rapidly apparent. But just in case you're not sure what the single whip law is, that's what it is. Now, I mentioned that Bolivia, the mountain of Potosi, was the main source of silver. Now, you might be wondering, how did the Spanish get all that silver? Well, they used an old system. So the Incan Empire had a labor system known as the mita. Now, in the mita, you contributed a certain amount of labor every year to the government. And so that's how the Incan Empire built those great vast roads and great temple complexes we always talk about, right? So the Spanish, though, needed a labor source to mine the mountain of Potosi. Legend has it that one day a shepherder in 1545 was looking for a lost llama, and he climbed up the mountain of Potosi, and he lost his footing, and he grabbed a plant, and the plant ripped out of the ground, and as the dirt fell away, he spotted a vein of pure silver, and that's how the mountain was discovered. What's interesting to note is that initially, for the first about 15 to 20 years of the mining operation in Potosi, the Spanish utilized the old Incan system of extracting silver from ore, which was to soak it in water, wash it with water, and try to physically break the silver out of the rocks. Not the most efficient way to do things, but you could get a decent amount of silver. Now, what they began to use, though, was in Europe, there had been a system developed in Eastern Europe for extracting precious metals from rocks. And interestingly enough, the Chinese had actually already had this system going for about a couple of hundred years at that point. But what they would do is they would use liquid mercury, which they mined from another mountain about 80 kilometers away. They had all this mercury. And what they do is they soak the ore in mercury. And so the mercury attaches itself to all the impurities in the ore. And then you heat it up, and the mercury will separate from the silver and take away all the impurities. What you're left with is pretty pure silver. And so that's what the Spanish, this mercury process allowed them to get incredibly pure silver out of Potosi. Now, if you know anything about mercury, you'll know it's also highly toxic to human life. And so not only the backbreaking physical labor of going deep into a mine, but also working with these dangerous chemicals and vapors cost the lives of thousands of Indian laborers. It's not known exactly how many. Some scholars have tried to estimate, but the records are really sketchy. So one of the higher estimates is somewhere like 3 million over 200 years, which is feasible, but I will probably never really know for sure. It's going to kind of be one of those mysteries. So in terms of how the silver made its way around the world, of course, some of the silver went directly from Bolivia back to Spain, but a lot of it found its way over to Manila, the capital of the Philippines today. Now, remember how I said that the goal was still to get to Asia and Asian markets, right? So if you can't go around South America, you'll just build a separate system getting from what is now Mexico and Acapulco over to Manila. And so what the Spanish galleons would do once a year is they would sail up the coast all the way up sometimes to British Columbia. They would, that's the return trip, my bad. They would sail south from Acapulco down to Manila. And then on the way back, they would sail north past Japan, all the way to what is now like British Columbia, and then sail down the coast, stopping in Monterey, which is nearby where I grew up, and then they would make it back to Acapulco, right? And so this exchange essentially took silver from the Americas, took it over to Asia, and placed it in Manila. And then in Manila, the Spanish galleons would pick up Asian goods, rare exotic things, silk, spices, porcelain, custom-made luxuries like the biombu with the conquest of Mexico. That's a special like Japanese divider with a picture on it. And there's a custom one in the Mexican National Museum, I believe, that depicts the conquest of Mexico that somebody in Mexico commissioned to be made in Japan and then brought it back for the galleon trade. Now, it sounds really cool, except bear in mind that this was an incredibly deadly voyage. It was about 11 weeks straight from Acapulco over to Manila, and there were no stops. So the only food you had and the only water you had was on the ship, which explains why anywhere from 30 to 50% of the crew would perish on a given voyage. Now, the thing was that the Spanish never recorded ever stopping here, which is where Hawaii is, even though it is directly in their nearby their route. There's no evidence the Spanish ever discovered the islands of Hawaii, which would have been a great resting point for their their journey, but it's a mystery why they never did. But anyway, so the point is, because the goal was still to reach Asia, the movement of silver from Mexico to the Philippines, and then the movement of Asian goods from the Philippines back to Mexico represents that this continued to be a necessary part of the trading system. So remember how I mentioned that Manila was going to be important. Now, part of the reason that Manila is important is because officially European traders are not allowed to be in China, but Chinese migrants and people seeking to escape the government, a lot of them move to Manila, which is pretty close by. If you can see here on this map, there's China right here, and then you've got Manila right here on the Philippines, right? Maybe you stop over in this little island right here, but you get to Manila. And so the Spanish ships, when they arrive in Manila, they immediately begin to parlay with the local merchants of the Chinese community there. And the Chinese community there then takes some of those goods in maybe they've got special permission from the administrator. If it's the late Ming Dynasty, or if it's the early Ming Dynasty, they just straight up smuggle it back in. But that's how the silver gets from Spanish hands into China, right? Because officially the Spaniards can't go trade in China, but the Chinese community in Manila acts as sort of a go-between, right? Diaspora communities promoting trade. Right. And this is also true of the Japanese. So the Japanese, because there's a long history of Japanese pirates harassing the coast of China, the Chinese also officially forbid Japanese merchants from staying in China. And so Japanese merchants also go to Manila to trade they go to Manila to trade Japanese silver for Chinese goods and or Spanish goods, which they then take back to Japan. And so Manila basically becomes almost the middle ground of this three-way trade, right, between China and Japan and the Spanish Philippines. So that's why Manila is so important, right? The system by which the Tokugawa shogunate allows Japanese ships to leave Japan and go visit other places is called the Red Seal ship system. And so this system is also part of the kind of promoting trade, because it moves Japanese silver not just to Manila and the Philippines, but also down into other parts of Southeast Asia. So promoting the flow of silver was not just from Spain into Asia, but also from within Asia to other parts of Asia. So that inter-Asian trade I was talking about. So last but not least, I want to touch on something. This gets briefly mentioned in the article, but I want to kind of clarify why this is important. And so that's something called the price revolution. And this happens in Europe between around 1520 to 1680. And what this means is that there is so much precious metal flowing into Europe all at once from the conquest of the Aztecs, the conquest of the Incas, the discovery of Potosi and Zacatecas, both gold and silver. So much of it flows into Europe that the value of those things, the value of silver, the value of gold, begins to decline, which means that, again, there's some inflation going on. And that means that the average worker, your average laborer, actually sees their purchasing power go down, right? Because there's so much money, but there's not enough actual goods to buy. Your ability to buy goods falls and the price of things increases. That's not exactly what we in the United States and parts of Western Europe are seeing right now in 2021. Situation is a little bit different. There's been a serious disruption in the supply chains, but it is the same feeling, right? You might technically have more money because there might be more silver floating around, but you don't actually have the ability to purchase any more, right? And so this leads to all sorts of social consequences. It actually leads the Spanish Empire to go bankrupt several times because it owes so much money and it keeps importing silver, but eventually the silver can't pay off those debts. It leads to the weakening of the guild system as the guilds are unable to meet demand because everyone has so much purchasing power. And it even has far-flung effects in the Ottoman Empire, which now can't pay its troops. And this leads to several major revolts in the central heartland of the Ottoman Empire, what is now Turkey, because they literally can't pay their troops. And so the price revolution will have a drastic effect on the political and social situation of Europe, and that's how it's connected to this vast silver trade. So that's all I got. Hopefully this gave you a nice context, a little some background before you go in and read Born with a Silver Spoon, but I hope you learned something. And I hope when you read Born with a Silver Spoon, you can make some interesting connections and maybe draw some fascinating conclusions. I don't know. Feel free to reach out to me and let me know if this helped. But yeah, that's what I got. And my name is Mr. Little, and thanks for watching.